I just moved to the University of Utah. I took a leave from the University of New Mexico to try out this sort of administrative role to see if it was something that appealed to me. And as the assistant vice president for faculty equity and diversity, what I get to do is what I was doing a lot of at UNM, which ranged from thinking about how we do hiring around faculty. So can we be more inclusive? Can we be much more equitable? Can we be more humane in that process? Looking at policies. So where are the spaces and the places where inequities creep in? Just supporting underrepresented and marginalized faculty. I think oftentimes what happens is that, we have to have a little crew to support us because it's hard out there, especially for folks of color. And so I get to do all of those things in this position.
Thank you. Thanks for explaining the whole background. And also, I didn't say that you had been with the University of New Mexico and had been working there for a while. And so we were very lucky to have you here in New Mexico when you were here. And I'm sure students benefited from what you had to offer, which is an important perspective, and a perspective that we should keep in mind at all times, being a woman and a woman of color, and thinking about media and media representation, but also not just the woman, because it's gender representation, but also like how different mediums represent us and represent our communities and our culture, whether that is Native American culture or Black culture or mixed culture or trans culture or Hispanic, Latin, all of those things. So I'm curious to know what you find, what your thoughts are around media representation.
Yeah. So part of, I think, the magic of New Mexico is that there are just so many different groups of people. And so it's always such a nice reminder that, I can't just, talk about Indigenous folks broadly, right? Because in New Mexico, we know, well, are you talking about a particular Pueblo? Are you talking about the Dene? Like, who are you talking about? And so that, for me, it was actually really instructive and so generative to think about in my own work, is being very specific about who we're talking about when we talk about representations. And I think that sometimes we get in our heads, we're like, oh, well, I see Black people all the time in media, so they're good, and then I have to be like, okay, but what Black people do you see, and how are we seeing particular groups of Black people? Because, we're not a monolith. And so there has to be some recognition that for some folks, particularly white folks, that there's an entire spectrum, a whole gamut of representations available. So you can be the serial killer, you can be the CEO, you can be the doctor, you can be the mastermind villain, you can be president, you can be stay-at-home mom, you can be all of these things, right? And so all of these representations are always available. And part of what I try to talk about, particularly in teaching, but also in my research, is where is that sort of breadth of representation for everyone else? So can we have, right, women of color who are all of the things and not just, sexy neighbor, homely neighbor, teacher, right? One kind of extra doctor in the background, but not lead doctor on this doctor show. So yeah, so that is sort of where I am right now in thinking about representations, is how do we make as many representations, as many avenues, as many stories available as possible.
Yeah, thank you. And that's an interesting concept that you brought up, which is which Black people or which Native Americans. And it's the same thing that happens, just coming from the Latin American culture, the people, we talking about Mexican
Right,
people, Puerto Ricans, they're
right,
so different, South America and Central Americans are different, and even within each country, within the country, people are different, and so there is a lot of confusion, um, when we look at the other. But I guess it depends on who's doing the looking, and who's doing the thinking, and who's doing the observing, or are there observations, and who's doing the representing, right? Who's speaking about that specific group or not. So um, I find that fascinating. But I also, think as far as like, okay, so how do we bring this kind of education into our everyday lives? So first, we know that this kind of education is, in this kind of conversation, is already part of a lot of colleges and universities, right? And that, then we're looking at like K through 12, and then we're looking at the homes, and we're looking at like what we're consuming through the media, but also even just in, K through 12 education, and having that awareness and that continual conversation about like, how do we bring it in our, in our everyday lives, and what are some ideas? Um, and I think, the one thing that I have to say about that is just that we create mindfulness around issues as we discuss them. So the more they're out there, the more that we can be aware that there are different Black cultures, or or Latin American cultures. Yeah, and so I'm curious to know what your thoughts are on that.
yeah. I
Every
think
day, yeah.
Yeah, you totally just hit the nail on the head. Part of it is just even having these conversations. Um, and recognizing it. So we know that in our own families, when we're talking with our families and friends, and we're like, oh, okay, this part of your family was from this part of Mexico, and we're a part of this group, so we have these conversations already on an interpersonal level. And I think having these conversations on a larger level, so in classrooms, but then adding in some action. So not just, okay, I recognize that there are different groups or different people. We don't have to, when we're thinking about like the classics in, say, English, it doesn't just have to be Shakespeare and Twain and, who was Little Women? Alcott, right? We can also add in other folks. And so, what does that? Who were we reading, right? Who did we read growing up? And so, why shouldn't we, of course, introduce that to our students? Or, maybe we didn't. Maybe we just followed along with what was set out for us in our own primary education. So, but there's nothing keeping us from doing a quick Google to say, hey, who are some other folks, right? What are some appropriate books for 8th grade? What are some children's books that I can bring in for my second graders that aren't just about, blonde haired, blue eyed kids? Are there other stories that I can tell from other places, other cultures, other peoples? And that's just the easiest way, is to just bring in more. So then our students will know, okay, right. We don't have to default to just this image. We don't just have to think of, the protagonist as always being this kind of person, right? Now we know that protagonist can be anyone, can be, we can have, what is it? Charlotte's Web was the pig and the spider, right? If we
Right.
have, animals that we respond to, that resonate with us. And then, of course, there's nothing keeping us from thinking about other folks, other cultures, other images, um, and bringing that into the classroom.
Mm. Thank you. And that is actually a really good input, for teachers and educators, as far as like what, having that consciousness around like, what are we reading? What are we consuming, and what, and what is the narrative
Yeah.
of what that is that we're putting out there for our students, and
Right.
and um, and so what it comes down to, I guess, is choices, right?
Right.
And I think it's similar as well to our home environment, right? Like, what choices are we making, and how are we, thinking about those representations? I know that I have a hard time not, when I want something, to have that disbelief, like the suspension of belief, or I have a hard time, not critically thinking about what I'm interacting with,
Mhm.
because I just continue to do media literacy on everything that I interact with. And so it just comes naturally to me. And, I sometimes get offended by certain movies that other people have like no idea that they're offensive, because of my perspective and where I come from and my own personal experiences. And I think that sometimes other people don't really, may not have those experiences, therefore they're not looking at something in the same point of view, right? or frame of mind in which somebody might be consuming something. And so the more that we can have discussions around books and media, whether it's a podcast or a book or um, a movie or whatever, infographic, that, like, it's still, we still have to look at, like, who's telling that story, and like who's being represented, and what point of view are we looking at it from, and who might be getting offended, or what point of view might be omitted from, from that story. um, as far as your job at the University of Utah, I know that you're working on making sure that the university has more like equitable, like, hiring practices and equitable courses as well.
I don't specifically look at like syllabi or coursework, but since I support faculty, a lot of that comes in. And so, how um, do we think about, particularly for faculty who teach classes on like race or gender, where students might not be so excited or so open, or, are having to balance the things that they've learned at home versus, what they're learning now in the classroom. And so those issues come in because those are also questions about inclusion and equity. And so we can't say that we, want more diverse faculty. We want, courses that reflect what the world is like, without also then protecting those faculty who teach, and encouraging students to learn to be uncomfortable, to learn to lean into that. So what is it that you are bristling about, in this class? Like, what is it that's making you uncomfortable? And so a lot of what I can do sort of on my end is to make sure that those faculty members are valued and are supported. When things go left, we got your back.
Yeah.
But also thinking about, retention and tenure. People use course evaluations, even though to me they feel like the YouTube comment section, where everyone, either people really hate you or really like you, and those are the comments that you get. And so, how do we show faculty that you are, one, free to teach this, right? Because we really believe and support academic freedom, but also that we will support you in teaching this. And so that means not dinging you when your evals come back and students were like, Pamela was terrible because she always talked about race and gender. Like, not everything is about race and gender. So then, how do we bring that back, right? To be like,
Right.
no, actually, you keep doing that, Pamela. That is what we hired you to do. We support you. Let's figure out how to do evaluations in a better way so that you're getting like actual constructive feedback. But also that you're hearing what the students have to say, and then can you incorporate it in a way that makes sense?
Mm. Yeah, thank you for that. I know like here we have these local groups and organizations who are, we're having discussions around equity and diversity and what does that look like and can we work together as a band of organizations and what could be done. And so I think there's a lot of questioning and self-questioning as we're like, are we actually being equitable and diverse? And are we taking it all into account as far as like how we're serving our community or communities. And I think that this conversation is providing a view, for what that looks like at the university level, but also could translate to what that looks like at an organizational level or at a school site level, as far as things to consider when
Yeah.
you're thinking about equity and diversity.
Right.
Yeah. And
And even just holding that you only know your experiences, right? And that you can learn from and hear about other people's, but you'll still, even in doing this work of like justice and equity and inclusion, right, you'll still center the things that you know. And so these are always ongoing conversations. I always get nervous when people are like, oh no, that's not how we do things. And I was like, okay, well, part of this work is that we should always be listening. Like there's always a learning. There's always a, what are we working towards? Because someone is always going to be left out. And so we need to be constantly doing this work of incorporating the folks. So yeah.
mhm. Oh, thank you. There is always a learning.
Right.
And so with that, I thank you so much for joining us. We will keep learning. I'll keep in touch with you through your super fun website, I have to say, Dr. Myra Washington. And I'm privileged and we're privileged to have you on the show. Thanks again for joining us.
Well, thank you so much for having me. And yeah, this was wonderful. And I love the work that you're doing. So I'm happy to be a part of this. So thank you.
Thank you. All right. Take care.
Bye.
Bye.